There is a moment, not dramatic, not earned through any obvious crisis, when you close a door behind you and the silence on the other side of it feels like exhaling for the first time in weeks. No one is waiting for your response. No conversation is unfinished. There is no version of yourself currently required, and instead of the loneliness you have been told to expect in these moments, what arrives is something closer to relief. That relief is information. The Stoics would have recognized it immediately and treated it not as an accident of mood, but as a precise signal from the interior, the self-reporting, quietly and without drama, that it has been under sustained pressure and is grateful for the interruption. This is where we begin. Not in rejection, not in the collapse of a relationship, in the ordinary mercy of an empty room, and in what that room has the capacity to restore. Cleanthes of Assos succeeded Zeno as the head of the Stoic school, and he held a view of the inner life that was unusual even among the Stoics, for its attention to what happens beneath argument and principle. He believed that the human soul, what he sometimes spoke of as the commanding faculty, possessed a natural coherence when left undisturbed. And that disturbance, accumulated over time through the sustained effort of social performance, was not merely exhausting, but deforming. He drew a distinction that is still precise today between the soul that has been shaped by its own genuine development and the soul that has been shaped primarily by its response to the evaluations of others. The first has a center of gravity, the second does not. It is always in motion, always adjusting, always waiting for external confirmation before it can settle. Cleanthes taught that solitude, deliberate, unhurried, without agenda, was not an indulgence or a withdrawal from duty. It was a form of maintenance. The commanding faculty required periods of non-performance in order to return to its natural coherence. Without them, it became progressively more dependent on the structure that performance provided. More reactive, less free. The first teaching is this: solitude is not what you do when connection fails. It is what makes genuine connection possible at all. Musonius Rufus was the Stoic teacher who most directly addressed the daily texture of a principled life, and he was particularly attentive to the ways in which constant social immersion produces a kind of moral drift that is difficult to detect while it is happening. He observed that a person who is never alone is a person who is never fully themselves, not because solitude is the only valid state, but because without it, the self has no opportunity to audit what has accumulated. Every social encounter deposits something: an expectation absorbed, a position softened, a value held a little less firmly because the room it was aired in found it inconvenient. None of these deposits is decisive on its own. Collectively, over sufficient time without examination, they become the interior landscape. The person does not notice the drift because the drift has been gradual, and because the social feedback they receive, warmth, ease, the pleasure of being agreeable, continuously confirms that what they are doing is working. What Musonius understood, and what he pressed his students on directly, is that working socially and working philosophically are not the same measure. A position that produces no friction may be a genuine position, or it may be a position that has been filed down until it no longer catches on anything. The only way to know the difference is to examine it in conditions where nobody's comfort is at stake. That examination requires solitude, not extended hermitage, not the abandonment of civic life, a daily practice, brief, honest, unperformed, in which you take stock of what you actually think, as distinct from what you have been willing to say. The second teaching is this: the person who never examines their interior in private will eventually find that there is very little interior left to examine. Epictetus returned to one question more than any other in his teaching, and it was not a question about external circumstance. It was the question of what belongs to you, not your reputation, not your social position, not the opinions that others have formed about you, but what is genuinely, internally, irreducibly yours. Applied to the problem of a self that has been shaped by prolonged approval-seeking, this question becomes a kind of archaeological instrument. It asks you to go beneath the layer of what you have presented and locate what was there before the presentation became habitual. This is not always comfortable work. The person who has been performing a version of themselves for a long time may discover, when they look honestly, that the distance between the performed version and the underlying one has become significant, that they have been agreeing with positions they do not hold, admiring qualities in others that they privately find hollow, softening their responses not because the situation called for gentleness, but because gentleness was what the relationship required in order to be maintained. Epictetus did not teach this to produce shame. He had no interest in guilt as a philosophical outcome. He taught it because he understood that the self, which does not know where it ends and the performance begins, cannot make genuine choices. It can only react, adjusting, accommodating, managing, which is not freedom. It is a more sophisticated form of captivity. What solitude offers in the Epictetan frame is the conditions for genuine choice, not because it removes all external influence, no state of being does that, but because it removes the immediate social pressure that makes honest self-examination almost impossible to sustain. In quiet, without the audience that triggers the management instinct, you can ask, what do I actually think about this? Not what I said I thought. Not what would have been safe to say. What is the actual position, the one that would survive the disappearance of everyone whose approval I was hoping to maintain? The third teaching is this: you cannot recover a self you have not first located, and you cannot locate it while you are still performing for the room. Seneca wrote to Lucilius about the practice of withdrawal, not from responsibility, not from the people who genuinely needed him, but from the relentless social noise that he believed produced a particular kind of interior poverty. He was specific about what he was withdrawing from: the company of people with whom he felt pressure to be smaller, simpler, more palatable than he actually was. He described this social pressure as an acid. It did not destroy in a single application. It worked slowly, through repeated contact, dissolving the edges of the self with such gradual efficiency that the person being dissolved rarely noticed until the dissolution was already advanced. His prescription was not permanent retreat. Seneca lived a life of extraordinary social complexity and had no romantic illusions about the monastery. His prescription was what he called the return to oneself, a regular, deliberate act of gathering what had been dispersed by the demands of social navigation and bringing it back under a single, interior authority. He believed that a person who had not done this in some time would find the return uncomfortable, because what had been dispersed included things that needed to be examined, positions held too loosely, commitments made too casually, the accumulated evidence of a self that had been managed more than tended. But the discomfort was not an argument against the practice. It was, in Seneca's view, confirmation that the practice was necessary. The resistance to solitude, the preference for distraction, for noise, for the reassurance of constant social contact, was itself a symptom of what the solitude was meant to address. The fourth teaching is this: the urge to avoid quiet is the first sign that quiet is exactly what is required. Posidonius mapped the territory between impulse and principle more carefully than perhaps any other Stoic thinker, and his insight into the relationship between emotional development and rational life was rooted in something that the simpler Stoic formula sometimes overlooked: that the emotional drives are not merely obstacles to wisdom. They are, when attended to with discipline, its source materials. His teaching on solitude was not about suppression of feeling. It was about the conditions under which feeling can be accurately read. The self that is in constant performance mode receives continuous emotional feedback, but that feedback is contaminated by the performance. The relief felt when someone approves of you, the anxiety felt when the room cools. These are real signals, but they are signals about the performance's reception, not you, about the underlying self. In solitude, the performance stops, and in the quiet that follows, the emotional data becomes cleaner. You can begin to distinguish between what you actually want and what you have been pursuing because it produced approval, between what genuinely matters to you and what you have told yourself matters because it was easier to believe than to challenge. This is the crossing Posidonius described, not from emotion to reason, as though they were opposed, but from the distorted signal to the accurate one. From the feelings that have been shaped by the performance, to the feelings that belong, without mediation, to the self. That crossing requires stillness. It requires the absence of the audience, however temporarily, so that what emerges is not a performance of feeling, but the thing itself. The fifth teaching is this: solitude does not empty you. It reveals what was already there, underneath everything you were managing for everyone else. What becomes possible after this work? After the period of honest silence, the uncomfortable audit, the gradual return to what is genuinely yours, is a different kind of presence in relationship. Not the exhausting presence of the person who is always adjusting, always monitoring the room's temperature, always editing before speaking, but the grounded presence of someone who arrives with a self that has been tended, who can offer genuine engagement because they are not simultaneously managing an impression, who can listen without calculating, speak without performance, and hold their ground not through stubbornness, but through the settled clarity of someone who knows, from regular examination, what they actually stand on. The friendships that form with that kind of presence are fewer. They do not form easily or quickly. They do not depend on agreeableness or the comfort of seamless social friction. They depend on something more demanding and more durable, the recognition of one genuine self by another. Cleanthes understood it. Musonius returned to it through the discipline of daily life. Epictetus named it with his characteristic precision. Seneca felt it in the relief of honest withdrawal. And Posidonius traced it to the deepest emotional work a person can undertake. The quiet room is not where you go when there is nothing left. It is where you go to find out what remains when the performance finally stops. What remains is not nothing. It is not too much, or too difficult, or too inconvenient for genuine relationship. What remains is the only version of you that can be trusted, because it is the only version that has never been designed for someone else's approval. If this moved you, comment "The Citadel holds" below. It is our sign that you carry the philosophy with you. Subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.